Chapters 3 and 4 of Napoleon and Marie-Louise, The Fall of the Empire, by Walter Geer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 3. 1807. The Queen of Prussia. The negotiations for the Treaty of Tilsit were different from any before or since that time. There were no conferences at a fixed hour, no ambassadors, not even any secretaries. "I shall be your secretary," said Napoleon to Alexander, "and you will be mine." The two emperors saw each other and conferred at all hours. The court of Prussia was kept informed by the Czar of all the phases of the negotiations. Frederick William clung obstinately to the idea of preserving some of his territory on the left bank of the Elbe, especially Magdeburg. This strongly fortified city, one of the commercial centers of Germany, which had been annexed to Brandenburg by the Great Elector, was considered as valuable as a province. From the first, Napoleon had refused to have any negotiations with the king, and he was forced to plead his cause through the mediation of Alexander, who was becoming tired of his role. To find a way out of this embarrassing situation, the Prussian ministers suggested a supreme effort. This was to send for Queen Louisa to make a final plea for her unfortunate country. The beauty and the grace of this queen had long been a force in European diplomacy. Her fascination for Alexander had in previous years attracted and retained that monarch in the Prussian alliance. It was Louisa who had planned the memorable scene when, prior to the last Austrian campaign, the Czar and the king pledged their fidelity to the coalition over the tomb of the great Frederick, at midnight, in the garrison church. Before Jena, she had been the life and the soul of the Prussian war party, and had drawn the nation into that disastrous adventure. Napoleon, who rightly held her largely responsible for the war, had spoken of her in his bulletins in very uncomplimentary terms, for which he was reproached by Joséphine in her letters. After the campaign, Louisa had found refuge at Memel in East Prussia, the most remote city in her dominions. From this sad retreat she followed anxiously the negotiations which were to decide the fate of her country. When she was asked to come to Tilsit to plead with the conqueror, who had assailed her both as a sovereign and as a woman, she had a momentary feeling of revolt, but finally yielded to the sad necessity. Her visit to Tilsit was officially announced. On the 6th of July Napoleon wrote Joséphine, "The beautiful Queen of Prussia is coming to dine with me to-day." On her arrival at Tilsit, Louisa was received with military honors, and entered the city in a court carriage. She was accompanied by two of her court ladies, whose toilettes, excellent examples of German taste, faisaient mal aux yeux. In spite of the emotion which almost stifled her heart, the queen was divinely lovely, with the slightly languishing grace of her bearing, and the vaporous elegance of her toilette of white crape embroidered with silver, a diadem of pearls on her forehead. She went directly to the humble lodging of her husband. There she was surrounded by the Prussian ministers, all prodigal with their words of advice and encouragement. "For heaven's sake," said the poor woman, "give me a little rest, so that I may gather my thoughts." Suddenly she heard the cry that the Emperor was coming. Napoleon arrived on horseback, a short riding whip in his hand, escorted by his marshals and his whole staff. The king and his suite advanced to meet him. The Emperor dismounted and ascended the steep and narrow staircase to the apartment of the queen. When Louisa apologized for putting him to so much trouble, Napoleon gallantly replied, "What would one not do to reach such an end?" After inquiring how he liked the northern climate, Louisa plunged at once into the object of her visit. She bewailed the misfortunes of her country, which, blinded by the glorious recollections of Frederick, had been cruelly punished for provoking the issue of war. She endeavored to give to the scene a touching and pathetic character, worthy, as Napoleon said later, of a tragic actress. Napoleon vainly endeavored to turn the conversation into lighter vein by complimenting the queen upon her toilette. "Is it of crêpe or Italian gauze?" he asked. "Shall we speak of dress in such a solemn moment?" replied the queen. She remained mistress of the occasion, and expressed all that she had to say, demanding the restoration of territory in Westphalia and the north, and above all Magdeburg. "You ask much," replied the Emperor, "but I will think it over." With these words of hope he took his leave. That evening the queen was invited to dine with the Emperor. At that time Louisa was 31 years of age. Although of medium height, she had an imposing carriage; her walk was full of grace, her profile admirable in its regularity, and she still retained that fulness of beauty which follows the first flower of youth. We are all familiar with the celebrated portrait by Richter in the Museum at Cologne, in which the Queen is depicted at a somewhat more mature age, the goitre cleverly concealed by a scarf around her neck. Just before the dinner occurred the celebrated "scene of the rose," to which Napoleon alludes in one of his letters to Joséphine. Taking a beautiful white rose from a vase on the console, the Emperor offered it to Louisa. For a moment the Queen hesitated, then she accepted it, saying, "Yes, sire, but at least with Magdebourg." Napoleon replied, "Your Majesty would do well to remember that it is for me to offer, and that you can only accept." The response was perhaps rather severe, but as Napoleon remarked later, his gallantry would have cost him dear if he had exchanged cities and provinces for an act of politeness. At table the Queen was seated between the two Emperors, at the right of Napoleon, who had the King upon his left. During the dinner Louisa resumed her attacks. She employed all the power of a cultivated mind, of a refined amiability, of an able coquetry, to gain her ends. It required a constant care on the part of Napoleon not to be caught in any trap, and not to pronounce any word which could be considered as a promise or be called an engagement. During the rest of the evening the same struggle continued, the Queen seizing every opportunity to arrive at her ends, Napoleon skilfully avoiding her redoubled attacks, without for a moment ceasing to be perfectly amiable, and rivaling the Czar in his courtesy. In the Memorial he says, "In spite of my address and all my efforts, she showed herself constantly mistress of the conversation, dominating it always, and returning continually to her subject, perhaps too much so, but with great tact, and without giving cause for anger. It must be admitted, however, that the subject was important to her, and the time short and precious." Nevertheless, Napoleon, while preserving complete control over his feelings, and gallantly doing the honors of his table, was secretly impatient, and had no idea of exposing himself again to the wiles of so clever a woman. As soon as the Queen had left, he sent for the two plenipotentiaries, Talleyrand and Korakin, and insisted that the treaty should be drawn up and signed immediately. The treaty was accordingly executed the following day, the 7th of July. The fruitless efforts of the Queen had only served to hasten the conclusion. In a letter to Joséphine, Napoleon thus sums up his impressions of Louisa: "The Queen of Prussia is really charming. She is full of coquetry for me, but do not be jealous. I am an oilcloth, upon which all that simply glides off. It would cost me too dearly to play the gallant." The poor Queen returned home completely happy. She thought that she had been so successful that she declared herself ready to prolong her stay, and establish herself indefinitely at Tilsit. The following day she was ready to resume her attempts, when she learned with stupefaction that the treaty was signed. She appeared very indignant, shed many tears, and complained bitterly that she had been deceived. Resolved not to see Napoleon again, she was unwilling to accept another invitation, and only agreed after a personal visit from the Czar. She cried loudly that she had been grossly deceived by the Emperor, who had broken his word to her. This was absolutely denied by Alexander, who had carefully followed the entire conversation. She finally acceded to his insistence, and consented to visit Napoleon, but not without showing her disgust while assuming the airs of an offended coquette. She wore a splendid but rather theatrical costume of red and gold, a muslin turban on her head; but her eyes were red with weeping, and her face discomposed. Napoleon tells us that at the moment of leaving, when he descended to escort the Queen, she said to him, in a sentimental and impressive tone, "Is it possible that having had the good fortune to see so closely the man of the century and of history, he does not give me the liberty and the satisfaction of being able to assure him that he has attached me to him for life?" "Madame, I am to be pitied," gravely replied the Emperor. "It is indeed my unfortunate lot." With these words he took leave of her for the last time. Entering her carriage, and bursting into tears, she called Duroc, whom she highly esteemed, renewed all her complaints to him, and said, by pointing to the mansion, "There is a house in which I have been cruelly deceived." She complained also to Alexander that she had been a victim of bad faith, but could not recall any positive assurance of the Emperor. Her mistake had been to believe that the passing homages rendered to her charms signified a profound and irresistible impression, carrying with it submission to her empire. Brusquely undeceived, she felt herself betrayed, and parted with embittered feelings from which she was never to recover. "If my heart is opened," she said in the words of Mary Tudor, "they will read the name of Magdebourg." The treaty with Prussia was signed the 9th of July and ratified 3 days later. Frederick William lost a third of his estates, all that he had possessed in Western Germany and in Poland. He undertook to close his ports to English commerce. In addition, he promised on the 1st of December to declare war on that power if peace had not previously been concluded with France. At this price the king was nominally to re-enter into full possession of his dominions; but by a supplemental convention it was provided that the French troops were to evacuate Prussia gradually, and only in case the war indemnity had been paid. In this way Napoleon had it in his power to delay indefinitely the withdrawal of his forces. Unfortunately for Napoleon, Louisa was not the only person deceived at Tilsit. Under his affable air and open manners Alexander concealed all the finesse of an Oriental diplomat. Prodigal of polite acts and friendly protestations, he duped Napoleon with all the grace and all the elegance of a courtier of Versailles. He had captivated the Emperor by his crafty professions of admiration and by his empressement, which were almost filial. Alexander let Napoleon do most of the talking, and showed himself an attentive listener. The Emperor told him the story of his first victories, which had filled the world with amazement — the campaigns of Italy and of Egypt. Then in a tone of good fellowship he unveiled the art and methods of his métier. He pointed out that the secret of victory is not an unsolvable mystery, that in war presence of mind and sang-froid often upset the most profound calculations of the enemy. The whole secret is to be frightened the last. Alexander listened devoutly, and engraved in his memory all that he heard, well decided, as he afterwards related, to profit by it when the occasion arose. Flattered by Alexander's interest, Napoleon was also indiscreet enough to reveal the sources of his power, to explain the structure of his government, to pass in review the men whom he employed, indicating their origins, their passions, their different aptitudes; what price he attached to their services, how he preferred to overlook their faults rather than to dispense with their good qualities, liking better to bend than to break them. Responding to these effusions, Alexander very frankly confessed his visit to the "Pretender" at Miteau during the last campaign, adding that he considered his prince "the man the most worthless and the most insignificant in Europe." Napoleon agreed that the future Louis XVIII was lacking in all the qualities which a sovereign should possess. At the same time, Alexander displayed the most profound interest in the new dynasty which reigned over France. He desired Napoleon to speak of his family, of his household, of his most intimate thoughts. The Emperor then recalled his recent loss in the death of the eldest son of Louis, the child whom he termed the little Napoleon. He dwelt upon the grief of the mother, and showed that Queen Hortense occupied a great place in his affections. A few months later the Czar made a delicate allusion to these confidences, when he said to the French envoy Caulaincourt, on the occasion of the birth of the future Napoleon III, "Give my compliments to the Emperor. I am very glad that it is a boy." That Alexander deceived Napoleon at Tilsit, that his only object was to gain time, plainly appears in a work written by one of his aides de camp and dedicated to the Czar. The peace of Tilsit offered to the Czar none of the guarantees which should be found in an instrument of that kind. The erection of the Duchy of Warsaw was evidently a measure hostile to Russia. The conferring of the sovereignty upon the King of Saxony, who was descended from the former kings of Poland, also denoted the project of inspiring the Poles with hopes the realization of which could only be prejudicial to Russia. Even the city of Danzig, which the French had the right to occupy until the conclusion of a maritime peace, could only be considered as a stronghold which Napoleon had reserved for his future operations against Russia, The Emperor Alexander could not misconstrue the spirit of these arrangements. But the unfortunate conditions then prevailing in Europe made it necessary for him at any price to avoid war. It was of the highest importance to gain the time necessary to sustain properly the conflict which every one well knew would be resumed some day. Therefore the famous Treaty of Tilsit was, for one of the contracting parties, only a truce, during which better to prepare for war. Napoleon confided in the good faith of Alexander, and the Czar was already meditating new perfidies. It is unnecessary to search further than Warsaw for the principal cause of the misunderstanding which threatened to bring about a new clash between France and Russia. In creating the Grand Duchy, a defensive conception in the mind of the Emperor, but calculated almost inevitably to assume an offensive aspect, the Treaty of Tilsit had introduced in the Franco-Russian alliance a germ of death, and contained the principle of its own destruction. Nevertheless, this treaty which concealed so many traps made an enormous impression on Europe, bringing profound disappointment to Napoleon's enemies and great satisfaction to his admirers. The decisive defeat of Prussia, the creation of the Duchy of Warsaw, the erection of a new kingdom in Germany, the homage of the Czar, whose treachery was not suspected, were all subjects of universal astonishment, and added a new renown to the already famous name of Napoleon. It was the apogee of his power, the most brilliant epoch of a career thus far uniformly successful. 4. A diplomatic reconnaissance. On the 9th of July the emperors parted, and Alexander recrossed the Niemen. From the bank of the river Napoleon made with his hand signs of au revoir. At 6 o'clock the same evening he himself left for Königsberg, where he spent 4 days. He then traveled directly to Dresden, passing 92 hours in his carriage. After a short visit to his new ally, the King of Saxony, he set out for Paris, arriving at St. Cloud early in the morning of the 27th of July, after an absence of 10 months. The following day he received the great dignitaries of the Empire. All the official discourses can be summed up in the fulsome remarks of the first President Séguier. "Napoleon is beyond human history. He belongs to heroic times. He is above admiration. Only love can rise to his level." Fearing that Alexander on his return to his capital might be swayed by interests unfriendly to France, Napoleon wished to preserve his influence by keeping constantly in communication with his new ally. Diplomatic relations were to be resumed at once, but the choice of an ambassador required reflection, and would take time. Meanwhile, the Emperor decided to send as a temporary envoy to St. Petersburg one of his aides de camp, Savary, who had been present at Tilsit, and seemed to be agreeable to Alexander. By way of introduction, Savary carried a personal letter from the Emperor to Alexander. "I pray your Majesty to receive him with personal kindness, and to place entire confidence in what he says on my behalf." Having lived for 10 years beside the Emperor, seeing him at all hours, Savary seemed well adapted to transmit the thoughts of his master, rendering not alone the sense, but also the characteristic form, which would recall to the Czar the many hours of intimate conversation at Tilsit. His mission had also another, and even more important object. The negotiations at Tilsit had been conducted personally by Alexander. What would be the attitude toward the new alliance of his ministers, of the heads of his nobility, of the leaders of the public opinion, of the society of the capital? Would all these elements be favorable, or would they influence the Czar to return gradually to his former hostile sentiments? The mission of Savary was therefore a diplomatic reconnaissance. He must consider near at hand the Russian society, study the factions, the coteries, unravel the play of intrigues, examine the meaning of creating a French party, size up the spirit of the army, and transmit upon all these points circumstantial details. Napoleon had need of all this information in order to appraise the Russian alliance at its true value, and shape his future policy accordingly. Savary's talents of observation and penetration admirably fitted him to play this role, and his interesting dispatches show how well he carried it out. Savary crossed the Niemen with a suite of officers and secretaries. As soon as he passed the Russian frontier he got an inkling of what was in store for him. he soon perceived that the Russian people still regarded the French as enemies. As Alexander had not yet rescinded the order to invoke the malediction of heaven on the French, enemies of the Czar, enemies of God, the people continued to pray in the churches for the extermination of the French nation. As the travelers approached the capital, the feeling of hostility became more evident and more bitter. Arrived at St. Petersburg, Savary even found it difficult to secure lodgings. No one wished to house him. The only welcome that he received was at the palace of the Czar, where he had an audience the night of his arrival. After inquiring as to the health of the Emperor, Alexander began to converse in a friendly and intimate tone, recalling the days at Tilsit, and displaying a great desire to be agreeable to the envoy. Savary has left in writing a report of this interview, as of all the others which he had with the Czar, putting it in the form of a dialogue which adds greatly to its vivacity and interest. After reading the Emperor's letter, Alexander said: "At Tilsit he gave me marks of attachment which I shall never forget. I appreciate the evidences of friendship which he gives me to-day, and I am grateful to him for having chosen you to transmit them to me." After a moment of silence he continued: "He is an extraordinary man, and we must admit that, although we have some rights to your esteem, you have a marked superiority, and it would be senseless to contest it. Besides, I hope that that is all ended. I have given my word, and I shall keep it." On the 24th of July, the day after his arrival, Savary dined at the Winter Palace, and a few days later at the summer residence of the Czar. On both occasions there were only a few guests present. A few minutes before dinner was served, the Empress entered with her sister, Princess Amelie of Baden. The Empress Elizabeth was very beautiful and very graceful, but she had never succeeded in winning the heart of her husband. Refusing to condone his many infidelities, she had retired more and more into herself, concealing her feelings under a mask of indifference, and living like a stranger in the court of the Czar. She received the French envoy with a polite apathy. At table Savary was seated at the right of the Czar, who talked mainly on military politics. The conversation was general, and there was an entire absence of constraint. After dinner the Empress and her sister soon retired. The Czar then took Savary to one side, and had a long and intimate talk with him. After speaking of his projected visit to Paris, in which he seemed to take great interest, Alexander turned the subject to politics, and inquired what were the Emperor's plans regarding Constantinople. Savary replied evasively that, while the subject had been mentioned, he had no instructions. The Czar went on to say that if the dissolution of Turkey took place, he hoped to share in the division of the remains, and counted upon the attachment which the Emperor had displayed for him. Then he turned to less delicate subjects. At the end of the evening Savary retired enchanted with his reception, and flattered by the manner in which he had been so freely admitted to the confidence of the Czar. Savary soon found that the Czar had no court, in the ordinary sense of the word. He lived more like a wealthy and powerful seigneur, surrounded by his private household and his intimate friends. He held but few official receptions, and never gave ceremonial dinners, because in that case he must occupy a raised seat like a sovereign. When the envoy, astonished at this simplicity, demanded whether there was really no court of Petersburg, he was told to look for it in the palace of the Empress Dowager. The Empress Marie, the widow of Paul I and mother of Alexander, had preserved in Russia a position without precedent. Her son, in mounting the throne, had expressed his wish that she should retain the rank, the allowances, and all the honorary privileges which she had formerly enjoyed. Detesting ceremony and liking only military pomp and parade, Alexander had practically divided the attributes of sovereignty into two parts, retaining for himself only the oversight of affairs, and leaving to his mother all else. Marie was well fitted to play this role, and time had only served to increase her prestige. A woman of great kindness of heart, devoting her time largely to charity and good works, she had founded an empire of her own, based on love and gratitude. She liked etiquette as much as her son hated it, and took pride in maintaining the sovereignty in its most imposing forms. The ancienne cour, as it was called, thus remained in Russia the great social power, and although destitute of authority, preserved a powerful influence. This court has been compared to the House of Lords in England. Slow to move and to decide, guardian of traditions, it moderated the movement of the state. It prevented without acting, and often, in order to preclude a measure from taking effect, it was only necessary not to approve it. Now this court had not ratified the peace with Napoleon, and it simply ignored the existence of the French envoy. Savary soon found this out, much to the injury of his amour propre. "The 30th," he writes, "I was presented to the Empress Mère at the Tauride Palace. My reception was cold, and did not last a minute in all." In vain Savary inscribed his name at the doors of the principal mansions. He was not admitted, and no one returned his calls. All the great houses of the capital were closed to him, and he was only received and welcomed at the Emperor's palace. As usual in such cases, the women were the most hostile. They were all French in their educations and their tastes, but French of the Ancien Regime, with a profound horror of the Revolution and all its acts. During the first weeks of his stay, Savary did not obtain access to a single mansion. When he dined with the Czar, the other guests left immediately after dinner, and he returned sadly home to the society of his secretary. A few weeks later there were several brilliant receptions to celebrate the fête of the Empress Dowager. On these occasions the Czar paid marked attentions to the French envoy, and the example of the sovereign had a favorable effect. "Faces are much pleasanter," wrote Savary. "Several doors have opened." At the end of 6 weeks of quarantine he was received in certain houses, and on the 23rd of September he was able for the first time to send the result of his observations on some of the principal personages of the court. He had made the acquaintance of Prince Adam Czartoryski, a great friend of the Czar, who had been in the Foreign Office before Austerlitz, was now a senator and member of the Council. Savary was unable to comprehend him, and formed a very unfavorable opinion of his merits. Among the principal officials of the Empire there were only 2 or 3, like Prince Lobanoff, designated for the portfolio of war, and Count Rumenzoff, Minister of Commerce, who were favorable to France. Among the officers who are sketched by Savary, there stands out the portrait of Prince Bagration, the hero of the late war, a gloomy, ambitious man who does not love the French. Foiled in nearly all his approaches, Savary now opened up a new line of attack, and paid particular homage to several ladies whom the Czar had distinguished by his attentions. It was in connection with one of these friends of Alexander that he won his most brilliant success. Introduced by her husband to Madame Narashkine, Savary was very well received, and thought that it would be possible by some small services to win her entirely to the French interests. He wrote both Duroc and Caulaincourt on the subject. Napoleon was pleased with the idea, but admonished Savary, through Champagny, that he had been indiscreet in taking so many people into his confidence. "Everything which pertains to the private life of a sovereign should be a sacred subject." After this official reproof, Napoleon wrote personally to Savary in a line of friendly brusquerie. "I never knew that you could be so gallant as you have become. However, the mud for your beautiful Russians shall be sent you. I am going to take care of the expenses. You will present them, with the explanation that, having by chance opened the dispatch in which you asked for them, I have wished myself to make the selection. You know that I am well up on the question of toilettes." It is doubtful whether these gifts were necessary to win the fair Marie. She was devoted to Alexander, and her dearest wish was to further his interests by being agreeable to his new ally. From this time on Madame Narishkin ably assisted the envoy in his social campaign, and procured his admission to many new salons. After 3 months of residence at the capital, Savary was finally able to send a full detailed report of his labors, entitled "Notes upon the Court of Russia and St. Petersburg." He states that it is necessary at any price to gain the Empress Mère and her salon. As to the method of procedure he is uncertain, but it is sufficiently important for the Emperor to give it his careful consideration. Savary states that he thinks the Empress Marie is very sensible to personal attentions. Every mark of deference is precious to her, and the smallest gifts are appreciated. He had remarked among her cherished souvenirs a service of Sèvres sent by Louis XVI., and tapestries given by Louis XV. To Catherine. He is sure that similar gifts, if of good taste and discreetly offered, will be highly appreciated, coming from the extraordinary man who fixes the attention of the world. "It is the elegance in the choice," he says, "and the grace in the manner of giving which above all fix the value of such things." Another point upon which he insists is that the new French ambassador shall keep open house, and entertain lavishly if he is to overcome the resistance of the diplomatic corps, and particularly of the British and Austrian ministers, the centres of the opposition. Lord Gower, the English ambassador, had the finest horses in Petersburg, the most luxurious equipages, the best table, a retinue superior to that of many German princes, and the Russian nobility were most susceptible to his influences. When the time came for Alexander to break with Great Britain and dismiss her minister, it was most important for the Emperor to have a representative capable of filling the void. He must be a man of great charm, of ancient name, capable of entertaining sumptuously, of magnificent presence, who would fear no rival. The choice of an ambassador at St. Petersburg had troubled Napoleon very much, and it was several months before he reached a final decision. In the light of Savary's last report he made up his mind to go outside the regular diplomatic corps, and send Caulaincourt, another of his aides de camp. He could not have made a better choice. Born in 1773 of a noble family, Caulaincourt early entered the army and did not emigrate during the Revolution. In 1800 he was colonel in the Army of the Rhine, and after the peace of Lunéville the following year, was sent by the first consul to St. Petersburg to negotiate an understanding between Russia and France. In 1804, at the time of the arrest of the Duc d'Enghien in Baden territory, he was sent by Napoleon with an explanatory note to the Grand Duke, which led to the charge that he was concerned in the execution of that prince, an accusation which he never ceased to protest. On the founding of the Empire he became Grand Écuyer, and in that capacity accompanied the Emperor during the campaigns of Austerlitz, Jena, and Friedland, and was present at Tilsit. Although attached by name and traditions to the Bourbon monarchy, he had given to the new regime many proofs of his devotion. A man of fine mind, of open and upright character, of distinguished presence, Caulaincourt was devoted to the Emperor, for whom he displayed a chivalrous attachment. His tastes, which were naturally elevated, inclined toward elegance and luxury. Napoleon rightly judged that no one at his court or on his staff was better fitted to fill, not only with dignity, but with éclat, the first post in the French diplomatic service. In a letter under date of the 1st of November he announced his choice to Savary in these words: "I shall certainly send Caulaincourt." Several days later the appointment was officially proclaimed, in spite of the strong objections of Caulaincourt. He bore the title of Ambassador Extraordinary, and was granted a salary of 800,000 francs, with 250,000 additional for expenses of installation. He was to be accompanied by a carefully chosen staff of secretaries and attachés, and was ordered to conduct the embassy on a luxurious scale in order to captivate Russian society. To prepare the way for his new ambassador, Napoleon spared no pains. He offered to purchase the wood and have 3 French vessels constructed in the Russian shipyards. He promised the army of the Czar 50,000 guns of a new model, and opened the French ports to cadets desirous of completing their naval education. At the suggestion of Savary, he laid plans to establish a French theatre at Petersburg, and ordered Talleyrand to provide actors. To the Czar he sent a handsome service of Sèvres. At the same time he began a direct, intimate correspondence with Alexander, in the effort to prolong at a distance the cordial friendship of Tilsit. From all these acts it is possible to infer that Napoleon lacked entire confidence in his new ally, and already considered the possibility of Russia's return to her former attitude. While cultivating the friendship of the Czar, and gathering all the fruits of his alliance, he was constantly on his guard against a new defection. End of chapters 3 and 4.